Houellebecq is considered a great contemporary author, and one cannot be said to be keeping abreast of contemporary literature without reading his work. That's a quote from the New York Times Book Review on the back cover of Serotonin. I don't know that I really agree with it, though. I heard somewhere that something like 4,000 books are published every single day. I think it's a little silly to say there's any one author that everybody absolutely has to read, maybe like To Kill a Mockingbird or something like that. For me, the first book I read by this author was called Submission. I picked it up, I read it, I didn't really connect with it for reasons I'll talk about later, but I kept hearing about him. His name kept being mentioned by reviewers that I really respect. He's also mentioned in passing in Adam Levin's book, Bubblegum, which is a book that I thought was terrific. I think very highly of this book. And I said, my gosh, I have to give Houellebecq another shot. So he also hadn't written that much. I mean, it wasn't that hard for me to find and make my way through 6 of his books. So if you're considering reading his books, where should you start? Now, if you want to skip straight to the end, the book I'm going to recommend is called The Elementary Particles. If you do want to listen to my reasoning why and listen to a quick overview of his catalog, let's keep going. The 2 things that I thought about were, first, how well will this book prepare you to read another book by this author? How much does it actually show his writing style? And secondly, how many of his big themes that he keeps returning to over and over again are taken care of or addressed in this book? Now, for me, those themes were, first of all, degradation, both of our bodies as we get older, and of civilization in general. Second, compassion. Why do we sometimes find it so hard to extend our compassion to the people that we love the most? And third, imagery. In lots of his books, he returns to the idea of why do we prefer an image of a real thing, a copy of a copy, instead of the real authentic experience itself. So I'm going to do this in tiers, and in the first tier, I'm going to put 2 of his books, Submission and Serotonin. These are 2 of his more recent books, and I personally started with Submission. It's not that I hated it necessarily. It's a story about a left-wing political party in France who is so terrified of the populist right that they form an alliance with the Islamic wing of the political party. Now, this goes well for them until it doesn't. And I thought this would have been a wonderful short story, a really great novella. For me personally, dragged out to novel length, I was pretty ready for it to be over. And Serotonin. This is a story of a guy and his life as he starts to enter old age. I didn't connect with any of the characters in it. It seemed very much like I was just sort of following him around so Houellebecq could continue to comment on French society. And I should say at this point that I'm reviewing these books as they are related to each other. Even a bad book by this author is still pretty good. In the next tier up, I'm going to put a book called Platform by itself. I am not going to hold the cover up because the cover on the copy that I have is still pretty racy. This is a book about a couple that go on a trip together, they fall in love, and they decide that the antidote to the repression or oppression that European adults have is for them to take her tourism business and sort of rethink it as a business offering adult trips to foreign countries. Now, again, this goes very well for them until it doesn't. I guess reading this book, the first time I read it through, it is just so full of explicit writing. I put it down, I was like, I'm not even sure what I read. I didn't expect to end up liking it, but in the days that followed, I just kept thinking about it. So it was a very thought-provoking novel. I would still never just hand it to somebody and say, hey, you got to read this, because it is an incredibly explicit novel. In the next tier up, taking a step up from there, I'm going to put 2 of his books. This is The Map and the Territory and Possibility of an Island. The Map and the Territory is a story about a very successful person. He's an artist and he gets famous making copies of copies. He takes photographs of maps, and after he achieves a certain level of success, he then switches over to making paintings of different artists. I found this book incredibly moving. It's a real meditation on why it is that we choose to create art. Towards the end, he writes about The fact that he only changed residences in the hope of regaining that bizarre impulse which had pushed him in the past to add new objects, described as artistic, to the countless natural and artificial objects already present in the world. Why do we just keep making so much stuff? There is a sequence in the middle where there's a really horrific murder involved. And the artist gets wrapped up in solving it. It's kind of a side project, but it definitely wraps into that overall theme of the novel and the relation we have to art and our own humanity. What prevented me from putting this at the top of the list is that it is a little bit more subdued than most of this author's books. I think that if you read this, you might, despite the fact that there is that horrific murder in the middle of it, you might get a false portrait of his writing style. But emotionally, this was the book that connected with me the most, the one that I read and I really put down and I felt something move. We have the other book in this tier, the second tier down from the top. This is called The Possibility of an Island. I really liked this book. This was a book about a comedian, and he's become incredibly successful doing shock comedy, saying really nasty things about people, and over time, he almost starts to hate humanity. Why is it that people keep laughing at these terrible things he said? He falls in with a cult that believes that cloning is possible, and the reader knows that eventually this cloning actually happens, because in alternating chapters you bounce back and forth between the story of this comedian's life and his involvement with this cult, and commentary on that story that has been written by the clones that thousands of years later have actually been created from him and are now reading his life story, giving their opinion on it, and in some way trying to live their own life in this sort of emotionalist way that they do. I thought this was a good book. It actually covers a lot of the same themes that you would find in all of his books, but especially in the Elementary Particles. It also has a sci-fi edge that I really don't find in most of Houellebecq's other work. So I don't know how well it prepare you for something else. But I think that the writing from the clone's perspective especially is just so beautiful. And it sort of puts the lie to the idea that this author is only famous because he's willing to say these outrageous things. The man can absolutely write when you give him a chance. Which brings me to the book that I would recommend people check out. This is called The Elementary Particles. To me, this book succeeded on every single level. It's a story of two half-brothers. One is this emotionally dead biologist who's really repelled by the world around him and nature and starts to wonder if there's some other way for humanity to actually replicate itself. Then his half-brother is this failure. He sort of dedicated his life to getting all the pleasure that was maybe he feels was denied to him when he was a young man or even a child. This book has an incredibly audacious beginning. He basically says there's been three big advancements in humanity. The first one was Christianity taking over from the Roman Empire. Then there was the Enlightenment and science taking over from Christianity. And now I'm going to tell you the story of the third huge advancement. Kind of took my breath away. I was like, wow, you're really calling your shot. And I think he really did pull it off. I thought this was a wonderful book. In addition to touching on all the themes that I talked about, also, you're going to find a lot of that stuff that makes you recoil. The images that once they're in your head, you can't really get them out. So, I mean, I would definitely approach this book with a fair degree of caution. But for me, this is the one that made me think the most. And it's the one that I think was the most representative of his work. After I read this, I was like, that's it. I'm going to read them all. So those are just my opinions. If you do choose to take this journey, hopefully this helps you figure out where to start.